Hi there, Ted.
How are you?
Good, good. So with that, I will call the meeting of the Metro Fire Finance and Audit Committee for 2021, March 25th to order. And public opportunities to discuss matters of public interest within the committee's scope, including items on or not on the agenda. Do we have any speakers?
I didn't receive any speakers beforehand. However, Art, if you could unmute all of our participants and give them a chance to speak.
Sure. Attendees, you have the ability to unmute yourselves if there's anything you'd like to present at this moment. That's no response.
Okay. Having no response, we'll move on to the consent agenda. And yes, please.
No, I move the consent item, Mr. Chair.
I'll second it.
We have a motion and a second. And will the board clerk please call the roll?
Yes, Director Jones.
Aye.
And Wood.
Aye.
And Roselli.
Aye.
Motion passes.
Motion passes. Moving then to action items, reserve funding policy with CFO Thomas. And so Amanda, are you ready to do that?
I am. Thank you. And good evening. So I'm here this evening to present recommended revisions to the district's reserve funding policy, which was adopted in 2013 and establishes target minimum and maximum reserve levels for different categories of reserves, including general fund operating reserves. This item is a follow-up to the January 28th presentation of a review of the policy and current reserve balances that indicated that the minimum and maximum target levels in the policy remain appropriate and that the district is largely in compliance with the established reserve targets, with the notable exception of the capital replacement reserve, where we have some work to do to get up to the minimum target balance. That review also indicated that updates to the policy are needed in order to reflect changes in other policies and practices that have occurred since the policy was adopted in 2013. The proposed revised policy incorporates the necessary updates, including eliminating the compensated absence reserve, which really has never been established as a separate reserve, but rather is funded in the annual budget. Also, a change is eliminating the deferred compensation plan reserve because the board in 2016 approved transferring that reserve to be held by the plan administrator. So it's no longer held by the district. And then additional changes include updating language for post-retirement medical trust fund to reflect changes in actuarial practices and terminology. Also, the changes include updating to reflect updating the early debt extinguishment reserve to reflect revisions that the board approved in 2017 to the pension funding bonds early payoff policy. And then finally, the policy revisions also include adding references to the development impact fees fund and the intergovernmental transfer fund, which were funds that were created since this policy was originally adopted in 2013. So with these changes to the policy, this policy would be up to date with our current policies and practices. I'm happy to take any questions you might have. Otherwise, the recommendation would be to refer this revised policy to policy committee.
Mr. Chair, I just have a brief overview question. Amanda, reading through this, it looked like it was pretty much either some language updates and or making sure that that coincided with our existing practices. It's a what do you call it? Just a technical language overhaul. Is there any item? I didn't find any item that really fell outside this cleanup language type of approach. Is there, or is my assessment fairly accurate?
I think your assessment is accurate. So if you'll recall, on January 28th, we talked about, we kind of had gone through a review of the policy and sort of looked at the minimum and maximum targets that were in there, and really felt that those were still appropriate and that the reserves the reserve categories were appropriate, other than the changes that I've mentioned, where some of them needed to be eliminated because they're no longer relevant.
Well, after this, the next year or two here, I would be, I'd like to have a discussion about perhaps increasing our reserve percentage. But for the moment, I thank you for your work, and Mr. Chair, I move the recommendation.
I'll second it. Thank you.
We have a motion and a second. One point I'd like to mention there is we have on our coming agenda, I believe in April, a discussion about our reserve levels and what the industry standards are. Am I correct about that, Melissa?
Not that I'm aware of, no.
Okay, all right. Well then,
Well,
Uh,
sir, Randy, wasn't, that's a reference to a strategic planning meeting?
that's in reference to a strategic planning meeting, and there was a discussion I had some time ago about looking at, since Amanda's team has done a phenomenal job, in my opinion, but looking at now that we're at the 15%, is that the right place for us to be?
So if I could jump in here, I mean, I think some of that discussion was included in the January 28th presentation.
Mhm.
And I think that is one of the things that we looked at. So just to kind of recap that a little bit, the reserve target for the general fund operating reserve in the policy as it's written is a minimum of 15% up to a maximum of 50%. So we have a range there, and really what we looked at was that minimum 15% does align pretty closely with what is generally considered to be an industry standard, which is the recommendation from the Government Finance Officers Association,
Right.
for a minimum of 2 months, which actually works out to be a little over 16%, but pretty close to that 15% minimum target. And I think that's kind of that's the rationale behind establishing that as the minimum. Whereas the maximum target that's in the reserve policy of 50% of our net budgeted operating expenditures, that maximum amount would really allow us to have a cash flow reserve that we don't have a need for now, because we have that, as you'll recall, that dry period borrowing availability from the county. But were we to reach a 50% reserve, then that would give us sufficient reserves so that we can meet cash flow needs and not have to rely on that borrowing. So looking at both of those things, and then we also kind of took a look at what happened during the last recession and how does that translate into what level of reserves we might think about. It really looked like that 15 to 50% was still the right range. We are, as you know, we have just recently gotten ourselves within that range. So looking at our goals going forward, what we talked about was, first, since we're not currently in compliance with the minimum target for our capital replacement reserve, that's probably the priority now in terms of our reserve goals. But then once that's achieved, let's look at enhancing the general fund operating reserve above the 15%, but within the target range. So we didn't feel like we needed a change to the policy at this point, and that really was appropriate when all of those factors were considered.
Yeah, I'm not advocating a change to the policy at all, but rather the information that the consultant group provided me about the industry standard at 16 point something or other seemed to me like that's close enough to where we are that it might be a worthwhile target. If for no other reason than for Metro Fire to say, and our reserve meets the level of the industry recommendation. So, but with that, let's go back to the agenda item. And I have a motion and a second, and will the board clerk please call a roll?
Yes, Director Jones,
Aye.
Wood,
Aye.
and Roselli.
Aye.
Motion passes.
Okay, with that, I want to again take the opportunity to express my appreciation for the work that Ms. Thomas does and for her team. It is impressive, to say the least. So our finance determined.
Ren, you froze up. You
Oh.
froze up, weren't able to hear everything.
Believe me, you missed nothing. Our next Finance and Audit Committee meeting is scheduled for April 22nd at a time to be determined. Seeing no further business, we're adjourned.